Welcome to Tank Talks, your personal think tank for startups and venture capital. I'm your host, Matt Cohen, founder and managing partner at Ripple Ventures. This week's episode is a conversation I had on Clubhouse with Chris Douvos to discuss how to build a lasting startup ecosystem. Chris founded Ahoy Capital in 2018 to help invest in the micro VC movement. Prior to Ahoy Capital, Chris spearheaded investment efforts at Venture Investment Associates and the Investment Fund for Foundations. He learned the craft of illiquid investing at Princeton University's endowment fund. Chris also authors the blog SuperLP, in which he chronicles his adventures investing in venture capital and private equity. On today's talk, I asked Chris his views on what makes an everlasting startup ecosystem. We cover why San Francisco has stood the test of time and how newer ecosystems like Miami, Austin, and Toronto stack up. Chris shares his thoughts on what makes Y Combinator such a great accelerator and why it may never be replicated. Finally, we chat about how COVID and remote work might change how we think about startup ecosystems in the future. Now let's get into this week's chat with Chris Douvos from Ahoy Capital. Thanks so much for joining us, Chris.
Hey, great to be here. It's fun to be on Clubhouse and couldn't imagine a better person to chat with.
I'd like to kick things off and talk about startup ecosystems as they are popping up all across the country and the world in the last several years with varying levels of success. So I wanted to first talk to you about the right mixture of ingredients that are needed when it comes to making a great startup ecosystem thrive over time. So a lot of people talk about the goal, when it comes to starting up an ecosystem is you need a bunch of different ingredients to work together. On this discussion, I want to talk about what leaders in their local communities actually need when it comes to building those blueprints and those ingredients on what worked and what hasn't worked so that hopefully everybody has success in building their own startup ecosystem. So why don't we kick things off with a little bit about what a startup ecosystem means to you and how they often get started.
I started my investing career at Princeton in 2001, and one of the things that was really interesting, I guess that makes 20 years. I feel like I'm a dinosaur, almost like the Hal Holbrook character in the original Wall Street movie says these like cryptic things like "Son, where you're going, I've been." The funny thing about 2001 was it was in the aftermath of this explosion of alternate ecosystems. It seemed like every venture firm had a Seattle office and a DC office and an Austin office and so on and so forth. And the investment results, out of a lot of these places just weren't that satisfactory, and they were the first things to go. And we spent a lot of time thinking about that, and there was a lot of, I guess, statisticians would call it collinearity, right? Like, did those investments stink because of those ecosystems, or stink because it was, kind of a crazy time and there was a lot of like investing pathology going on, not unlike our time. And so we spent some time thinking about that. And ironically, one of my first investments at Princeton was in a Seattle manager, which was fun. But one of our thoughts was, you looked at some of these alternate ecosystems and there wasn't a lot, kind of going on that was durable. And yeah, I'll get to an answer on this in a second, but just, kind of for underpinnings, two of the things that really influenced me were, Michael Porter's cluster theory, right? So I worked before business school at Mike Porter's strategy firm, and we did a lot of like competitive advantage of nation stuff. And how do you build a cluster, a kind of a critical mass? Why are all the best shoes from Milan? Why are the airplanes from, best airplanes from, Seattle, et cetera? And then, later, some of the Richard Florida stuff on economic geography was really interesting. And the big takeaway from Porter is that there are these critical masses of, frictional interactions. And the big takeaway from Florida is that the world isn't flat, it's spiky. And what he means by that is that people tend to congregate. Smart people want to be around smart people. And so, even though the world was quote unquote flatter than it ever had been, wealth was concentrating in what he calls superstar cities. And I totally recommend all the Richard Florida stuff, and he's up at UT, right? So great Canadian academic, and then the Porter stuff's really interesting too. And by the way, there's a really relevant question which we'll get to, which is like, how important is geography going forward? And I think historically up until 2020, geography was such a vitally important component. Because of, the history of Silicon Valley really was the history of frictional interactions and the presence of, kind of many ingredients. and and those ingredients in kind of critical mass and in ways that that the frictional interactions would would kind of create these sparks, and that existed like nowhere else in the world. And what are these ingredients? Well, capital is an important one, right? Talent is a critical one. But there's some others that that are kind of less, they're maybe a little bit more delicate. And one is what I call mentorship, right? And that's actually something that exists probably in Silicon Valley in ways that don't exist, in ways that are even today. Although we'll see after the diaspora, but the presence of people who have been there and done that, and then kind of recycle back into the ecosystem, either as on their third, fourth, fifth companies, or as kind of mentors and role models, and aspirational role models is really important. And that's why we saw Research Triangle Park never really flourished, because you had one great outcome there, and then everybody kind of dissipated. That's why historically, in London, they've had trouble, because you have a great company in London, and the first thing the guys do is and guys be gender neutral, is buy a villa in the south of France, right? Whereas the Bay Area has historically had this great kind of magnetism. Again, we'll see if that persists. So mentorship, and then momentum is another important one, because there's no more momentum oriented form of investing than venture capital, and heat begets heat. But then one that's actually not often talked about, which actually is one of the reasons why I'm still a California bull, is at least in the U.S. is what I call operating system. And California is doing a lot to kind of kill its operating system. But California has one thing that other places don't have, which is a very well established prohibition on non-competes. And so what that does is it actually, I before talked about friction and frictional sparks, that's facilitated by the kind of, engorgement and disengorgement of these, or disgorgement, I guess, of these companies and people in and out of these startups, and larger companies. And when somebody leaves, Silicon Graphics, which is kind of this really robust, kind of, actually it goes way back to the beginning of Silicon Valley, and Shockley Semiconductor and Fairchild Semi and Intel and so on and so forth. There's this kind of constant rejiggering of people and places. And in other other geographies, Boston is one that comes to mind. Seattle is another where they've been fighting in the courts. There's actually kind of corporate interference with with this type of fluidity. So, I think of it as, money, momentum, entrepreneurial management, mentorship, and, an operating system. Those are the kind of, for me, the five, keys to a great ecosystem.
Yeah, it's really interesting. There's so much to unbundle there about Michael Porter's thesis on how it's not, don't look at venture capital as an asset class, but look at it almost like a product and a market, because, looking at airlines, that's a product, and venture capital goes into many different products, but itself, the ecosystem that comes out of it is its own product, and how collaboration works in that industry more than others in different asset classes is definitely a big part of it. I mean, I remember working on Wall Street, hedge funds collaborate, but very in a kill or be killed mindset. But in venture, it's not really like that. It's very collaborative, and I'm sure more ecosystems are better at it than others. But I always wonder what type of, climate actually plays in gravitating people towards certain clusters. You say you start a company in London and you move to the south of France. Well, why is that? Well, it's a great place to live, probably good tax advantages, and it's also a really comfortable place to retire. We say in Canada, we have great working weather all the time. And that's great when you're building a company, but when you want to give back to the ecosystem, do you really want to spend all your time in Canada, or do you want to live somewhere in Miami or something like that? And that's why I think there's a lot of this conversation happening as well, because people gravitate towards where they want to spend their time working, but also mentoring and advisoring. So you mentioned something really obviously key, which is great ecosystems need three great things: great ideas, great talent, and access to capital. Can you explain what each of these really mean in relation to startups, and why certain areas have more success with some of these versus others?
One thing I love about venture, and actually is every day I wake up so excited to do what I do and to be able to to work in the kind of crafting of the future. Walt Whitman wrote in a poem in 1850. He said, in California, I see the genius of the modern, the child of the real and the ideal. And it's not just about California. That I think is emblematic of the whole venture ecosystem. And in venture, you kind of turn the game on its head. And what I mean by that is, if you think about economics, it's the science of scarcity, or the study of scarcity. And I'm kind of a techno-utopian, right? I believe that that what we're doing supports a science of abundance, right? And there's actually kind of collaborative, benefits. There's network effects and Metcalfe's law and all these things that actually kind of support the economics of of abundance. And I think it starts with the way the venture industry works. And that's why historically I've always thought, again, I don't mean to be too U.S. centric, but I've always thought that the Bay Area was much more robust over time than Boston, say, because in the Bay Area there's a kind of an open social graph, whereas in Boston, and we can name names of the venture capitalists of the 90s who were who kind of kept everything close to their vest and were about kill or be killed. And I think that early on, and maybe I'm idealizing a little bit, but early on, I think California got with the benefits of the open social graph that we can all become enriched. Okay, so long preamble to your question of so money, ideas, and talent. If you look at historically, and it's interesting too, because actually this is another one of the hypotheses I'm testing is, what does the world look like post 2020? Does geography matter as much? Like, does community become virtual rather than physical? And that's something interesting to unpack, and that's something that actually might take years to unfold. But another hypothesis that I'm testing is about the genesis of ideas. And what I mean by that is, if you look at the history of Silicon Valley, there's this great, I think it's actually a series on YouTube. It's called The Secret History of Silicon Valley. Everything that started here really started, it goes back to Fred Terman at Stanford and Hewlett and Packard, et cetera. But really during World War II, a lot of the research that took place and the massive federal funding that came in that magnetized a critical mass of engineers who, when the World War II ended, kind of stayed here because it was nice, right? And then you had these, fertile, fecund minds that, that kind of kept working on challenges, but they'd all been brought together. And so what are the, obviously universities are a great, magnetic entity that kind of bring minds together. But one hypothesis I'm actually testing is, in the future, do ideas matter, right? Like I've had a deep tech hypothesis for a long time, but like a lot of the things that are starting are actually applications of ideas, right? Like a lot of the enabling technologies that typically came out of universities are now commodities, right? I think we'll continue to see interesting stuff. We've done a bunch of direct deals recently out of universities, like novel polymers and stuff like that. But a lot of the really big outcomes are kind of applied technology, and that's less geographically dependent than I think some of the old stuff used to be, where it was kind of professors out of labs. So that's a big hypothesis I'm testing. Historically, I've thought that universities were the fount of of a lot of interesting stuff, and certainly that's a story of Route 128 in Boston. And while there's a lot of intellectual content down in Southern California, for example, those tend to a lot of the startups that we've seen out of there tend to be like applied technologies that could have actually, quite frankly, started anywhere. So that's an interesting question, right? Like, so what, where do the ideas come from? That might be more nebulous going forward. Talent tends to, kind of magnetize to itself. Like, smart people want to be with smart people. They tend to congregate. Actually, companies actually are a great aggregator of talent today. And quite frankly, like, I think in that way the world is flat, or as Florida would say, Richard Florida would say, spikier. I think, there's great talent here, obviously, at, Google and Mountain View, but Google New York, Google Seattle, Google, they're great people, and they're, coming and going. Of course, some are more, bound than others, kind of pursuant to my comment about, non-competes and whatnot. These big tech companies have resources available to them, that do attract, kind of a certain type of person, maybe somebody with a little bit less of an entrepreneurial streak. But I think as a rule, we kick big companies a little bit too much, here in startup world. There are a lot of benefits and a lot of advantages and a lot of economies of scale and scope and stuff like that. So I think, ideas, you need an anchor, but those anchors are much more geographically distributed. I do, however, think that, that the Bay Area is going to continue to be, in the US at least, a really important money center. And I think that that's going to continue to promote the proximity effects in startups and continue to, because the other ingredients are still present, it's going to take a long time for that, that capital to dissipate. And, it's funny because a lot of the story of the fact that Wall Street is where it is a function of the building of the Erie Canal, right? And so the Erie Canal kind of made kind of created New York as this kind of hub of commerce, and that's persisted for kind of technically 194 years, 196 years, whatever, since the opening of the canal. And I think that the presence of, all the incumbents, the kind of critical mass of talent, even though, to hear people tell it they're moving to, Austin or, Miami or Vancouver or the T dot, or wherever else, there's still a critical mass of people here. And I think that that's going to be, kind of a force to be reckoned with because there's a circularity to all of it.
First of all, I'm so happy you just dropped the T dot on the podcast. That's great. But in terms of all the people that congregate in front of Wall Street, early on to do the transactions, that was necessary back then. I don't think, people are going to need to congregate at the same coffee shops to be able to get access to capital and startups going forward. So I think we definitely have moved past that. But venture has always been a localized business, and I agree, will continue to do that. But in terms of COVID and the accelerant of doing remote work, doing remote due diligence, all that type of stuff, it feels like people were resisting it within the first parts of the year. But now more and more deals are being done like that. Don't you think that more and more ecosystems will get access to that capital and that remote talent so that they can start to actually build up those ecosystems and then recirculate it back into it?
I think that is certainly a dynamic that's at play. And I do think we're in the midst of a great national scrambling, right? Or global scrambling even, right? What I will say about that is we've been in a one-way market where capital is plentiful and cheap. The number of, for lack of a better word, blow-ups has been pretty limited. And so I think that things, and this is kind of the dynamic, one of the things that we found about the late 90s was, when, and I guess I came up with a nice metaphor for this on the fly. It may be a nice metaphor, I don't know. The question is, if you're planting a field in northern Alberta, because we've had a warm winter, if next winter's cold, that field is gonna, you're not gonna have much of a crop. But if we've got global warming and northern Alberta now has the same climate as, Kansas, you might have some, pretty nice wheat or whatever. And I think that's the question, right? Like somebody said to me the other day, a public markets investor said that the entire market is riding on a razor's edge right now. And the two sides of that razor's edge are we low? And he's talking about interest rates. Are we low for long or low forever? And if we're low forever, right, then, that has certain implications. If we're low for long, at some point there's going to be a paradigmatic shift. And as part of that paradigmatic shift, there's going to be a lot of wreckage. And usually what happens is the tide recedes in ways that, first engulf the more nascent neighborhoods, as it were.
Well, it's like Buffett saying, rising tides lift all boats, and then we see who's left without their trunks when the tide goes out. And I think that obviously everybody's been waiting for that for a very long time. At the beginning of COVID, everyone was waiting for that, and we still haven't seen it. But we could talk about sort of the market dynamics forever, but in keeping on trend with sort of the startup ecosystem, a lot of people talk about access to customers. People often think that fintech companies can only get started in New York City because that's where all the financial institutions are headquartered. However, we've seen areas like Utah and East Coast Canada even build unicorns like Verafin without being based in those financial centers. So why do you think that is? And will we see more of that?
I think it's been really interesting. Atlanta's been like a really interesting little fintech hub. And I'm sure that we're going to see a lot more kind of dispersion from these centers. But what keeps the centers is the critical mass of talent. And so any company that you name, needs at its heart, a founder and a founding team, at the very least that know what they're doing. And those people, and I do agree that, that with this great scrambling, or the great bug out, whatever you want to call it, smart people in certain ecosystems are going to be certain, industry ecosystems are going to be more dispersed. The reality of it is that, that critical mass is going to remain important. And the question is, it's like, escape velocity, right? Like you need, 11.2 meters per second or whatever it is to escape the Earth's gravitational pull. One company does not make an ecosystem. We saw that in Research Triangle Park, where I think, the one great win of the 90s was Red Hat. Then everybody kind of dispersed, and it's been like a good back office for things. But we haven't seen, kind of really great companies come out of there, if I'm not mistaken. So, as we see people, these places spread and this diaspora of people, it'll be really interesting to see if people stick, and then the successful people kind of, get disgorged out into, and as they go out, start other companies. And then when you get the second, third, fourth generation companies, that's when you actually start to see that, that permanence to an ecosystem.
Well, it's interesting because that kind of like makes you think about Y Combinator and sort of the importance of incubators and accelerators and their success to, giving back into that sort of alumni network. And obviously YC's alumni network is great, and it's been going on for, a decade now, and we see all the success that they've had. But it makes you think how important those are when 90% of YC's program and the founders are remote. They only need to be there on Tuesdays once a week. But a lot of them do go to San Francisco for the batch program, or they fly in for it. So what do you think about incubators and accelerators and their role in playing in the startup ecosystem?
I might not have the best data on this, so it's really anecdotal, so feel free to push back on me. I've had conversations with people where they say, accelerators and incubators are amazing, and look at Y Combinator. And I ask the question, is Y Combinator the exception that proves the rule, right? Like, do we see, any other geographically based incubators and accelerators, get the kind of, lift, that YC does, for its companies, and then creating that sustainability flywheel. And I'm not sure that there are. With respect to YC, I think part of their, and again, what they did, and I think they're emblematic of the of the moment in a way. What they've done is they very cleverly figured out early on that momentum and audacity were going to win, and you just had to do everything bigger, faster, with more scope. And so the sheer volume of stuff that goes through there almost guarantees that they're going to be successful. Now you're right. What they've done is they've been very clever about creating the flywheel. But, Y Combinator definitely has its discontents out there who, talk about uneven quality and what have you. And so, I tend to think that, you can, franchise a McDonald's and have a burger taste the same in Santa Barbara as it does in Savannah. Venture is a kind of a craftsperson's game that, that kind of nurturing and, intensity of intimacy can kind of be a really constructive and positive thing.
So it's kind of like chicken and egg, though. Like, is YC the product of an incredible ecosystem that they have just been able to kind of mooch off of, or it's so vital to keeping that San Francisco startup ecosystem alive that without them, we don't know what it would look like? Like, that's what you're saying.
I think San Francisco San Francisco attracts, its own set of startups with or without Y Combinator, even a preponderance of startups with or without Y Combinator. What I think they've done terrifically well is create a flywheel, that just keeps spinning and spinning and spinning. And kudos to them. It was, if at any point during the last 12, 13 years we'd had a kind of a startup recession, they might have stumbled, and we might not be talking about Y Combinator today. But they were in the right place, the right time, with the right level of audacity.
Yeah. See, I think about them as the way that they do have a gravitational pull to San Francisco, and they keep founders there. And it has been working very well, because Techstars is the opposite model, where they have franchises all over. Their burgers kind of look and feel the same, but all of the founders that come out of the different Techstars programs don't stay in the cities that they technically went to have that experience, which makes me think that the startup ecosystems that they choose to start in may not be the ones that are as strong as, let's say, a San Francisco, and those founders end up there at the end of the day. Do you know what I'm saying? Like, it feels like YC holds you into that ecosystem longer.
Could be. And again, this, like I said, this could be changing. Time will tell. But one thing that was interesting to me in the early days of First Round was that Josh Koppelman talked about the opportunities in geographic arbitrage, right? So they would find companies that were not in the Bay Area and move them into the Bay Area, because that was the place where they could scale best. I think about, what's that course that Reid Hoffman and John Lilly and those guys teach at Stanford? Blitzscaling. I think, you can build a company anywhere, but I think, the ingredients for blitzscaling a company, still exist, most abundantly, in the Bay Area. And I think that's going to continue to be an important strength. Even if you think about, Atlanta, which is an emerging ecosystem, which I think is much more interesting than Miami, which somehow has gotten, buzz. I continue to think that Miami is the QAnon conspiracy of venture. Like, people are just making this up, because I've done business in Southern Florida, and it's a wacky, wild place. I think it's a lifestyle move on a bunch of people's parts. But that said, you look at a place like Atlanta, and you can build companies, but boy, I bet, if you had the blitzscaling mentality, the talent available for blitzscaling, and and then the proximity to capital, that the Bay Area has, that's just as an example, that's an ecosystem that would be, we'd be talking about, dozens and dozens of startups, coming out of there. Whereas now it's a good number, but it's not dozens and dozens and dozens that are really making a mark.
Yeah, well, I mean, you just dropped the Miami bomb, and I'm sure you're going to get lit up tonight on Twitter. So that's great. Thank you for doing that. So just continuing on that thought, Chris, how do you think COVID and remote work is going to change how startup ecosystems thrive and survive?
My own portfolios, I look back to, kind of 2012 versus 2019. One of the biggest changes was, even though our number of by number, our managers still remained, kind of predominantly Bay Area. The number of companies, headquartered here had dropped from about 85% to about 65%. And some of those were, into other ecosystems. But other companies, one thing we saw was the beginning of the rise of, entirely virtual companies. And I think those will be, more the rule in the future than the exception. That said, the money was still coming from Bay Area managers, at least in the States. And I think that, that the money center nature, was kind of creating that magnetism. And so I think that, we'll continue to see, kind of virtual companies, will continue to see, kind of mini multinationals with, kind of a few people in a place or two, but then, widely distributed workforces, and I think COVID's only accelerated that. But, the future's, already here. It's just not evenly distributed. And I think startups were, everything that people talk about with, Zoom and this and that, most of the startups that I know were already there.
Yeah, it's interesting. Like, a lot of our companies that have been hiring remote people, remote talent, are still people that are working in areas that have startup ecosystems. And I'm wondering if they work for a unicorn company one day, and that company ends up, paying off big for them, do they end up staying in their local community where they have been living and working in some far-flung place and start giving back to that ecosystem? And are we going to see that kind of ripple effect happen? Or, as you mentioned earlier on in the talk, are people going to take that experience and bring themselves into, I don't know, let's say south of France? Wow, you're getting lit up right now, Chris, and I have no idea how popular you are.
I apologize. I'm afraid to mute it because it might wreck my setup. I think that's like the tightrope that ecosystems walk, which is, successful companies, you need successful companies, but successful companies tend to, kind of build their own inertia and their own dynamics, and don't often disgorge people. Like for a long time, people didn't, Seattle was hampered by the success of Microsoft. Boise, Idaho, for a long time had the most engineers per capita because I think that's where Micron is. But the success of those companies, prevents people from spilling out. And then, as I mentioned earlier, some of the legal and regulatory framework, that causes people to stay places and people can get comfortable quickly. I think one of the stories of Silicon Valley, which is actually important for other ecosystems to think about, is how to encourage failure, because failure creates this kind of natural, fire that, in turn, the ashes of which, kind of fertilize the soil. And so you need successful people because you need role models and angel investors, but you also need that failure. That's a big hurdle for ecosystems to jump. And quite frankly, that's actually something that has surprised me positively about some of the European ecosystems. I don't track Europe as robustly. Historically, European investors have been European talent has been extremely risk averse and much more interested in company cars than equity. But we've, with the new generation, seen a real flourishing there, and that's outstanding. I will say, by the way, one thing that I don't know if this is a place to say it, but kind of sticks in my mind a little bit is I think actually the biggest threat to ecosystems, is the drying up of talent. We keep talking about the reshuffling associated with COVID. But I think one thing that's been, kind of critically damaging to the United States, and we all know the stats, 52% of NASDAQ companies were founded by immigrants, et cetera. I think the anti-immigrant rhetoric, of the last few years has really gone to benefit Canada. I see a lot of entrepreneurs who might come to the West Coast, go to Vancouver. See a lot of entrepreneurs who might have gone to the East Coast, go to the T-Dot, go to the Six. If there's a way to wreck an ecosystem, most quickly, it would be, via, kind of cutting off the supply of talent. And, the 60 years following, the end of World War II were a story of all the, world's best and brightest coming to the United States. And, starting after 9/11, we started seeing that reverse somewhat.
Yeah, well, I appreciate you recognizing the benefits that we've been seeing in Canada. Please don't give away our secret sauce, though, just yet. We still have to find all these great immigrant founders before we get soaked up by the West Coast investors. But I think it's a great time now to maybe turn it over to the audience and bring some people up on stage. So I know, Shaheen, you had your hand up before. Do you have a question here for Chris or I?
Yeah, I had a comment, actually. And hey, Chris, hey, Matt, great to see you guys here, or hear you guys here. So, as far as ecosystem, being a Bay Area native, what I've realized, there's a very, very powerful cultural component in the Bay Area, and that is putting in a lot and expecting very little. Us VCs tend to, really, let's just say, care a lot about our egos. But the majority of the folks that are, working away in Silicon Valley are from the culture of working very hard, expecting very little, and aiming to benefit the community and push the state of the art. And so, I actually moved to LA for grad school in 2002. Between 2002 and say 2013, when I was full-time in LA, and I started commuting back to the Bay Area every week, starting in 2013, LA was always just right around the corner. But what I saw that was missing in LA wasn't just what Chris was talking about, which was, there isn't as much money down there, and there isn't as much, as many companies. But what's more important is that the culture isn't there. And so I'm curious to hear from both of you, actually, whether you think that, this whole COVID thing has led to this culture of the startup culture, the startup engineering culture, no longer being concentrated, not just in the Bay Area, but in any geography. So it's just a matter of tapping into that community, which is now which could be maybe dispersed in the future. And it's a culture, that Silicon Valley culture, which could be anywhere on the planet, that, the best companies should be tapping into versus just, just by default looking at Silicon Valley.
There's several ways to answer that question, but and I think it's an important one. I think you've Shane probably got much better perspective on it than I. But I actually think that this reshuffling of people and the ability of people to work remotely is going to put a lot of pressure on geographies to compete for talent. And what I mean by that is, if you imagine a world where people can choose where to live, people are going to, make a decision, where is the best lifestyle, right? And lifestyle used to be, kind of where the job's available. But, as mobile workers, untethered, if you can choose to be anywhere, why not be in, kind of San Diego or, Jackson Hole or wherever? And so I think, this actually is one of the things I'm most worried about. It's actually interesting because I haven't listened to it yet, but Richard Florida has a podcast where he talks about kind of the future of what he calls superstar cities. There's an assertion out there that superstar cities are going to start. This is the end of superstar cities. People can now live wherever. And Florida counters by saying, actually, superstar cities, as they always have throughout history, will have the critical mass of kind of culture and opportunity and engagement, and congregation that people want. So this, even in a post-COVID world, superstar cities will continue to thrive. He says, except maybe for San Francisco. And I haven't listened to why. I've just read the little blurb on Twitter, but I do think that this is a real question. That San Francisco is a really poorly governed city, and kind of why is that? And what does that mean for the future? And so, I think cities will have to start thinking of themselves as products, not in the way that, Mike Bloomberg used to say living in Manhattan is a luxury good and you should be willing to pay up for that. I think that's wrongheaded. But how can you create the livable city in a way that attracts people and engages them?
Yeah, I think we've gone through history and we've seen a lot of different, technical changes from railroads connecting all these small different communities along the way from New York to San Francisco. We've seen telephones help people communicate across longer distances, and then eventually the internet and now satellite internet. So we've gone through these technical innovations that have broadened the ability for people to live farther away from centers of commerce. But I think this one is a little bit different because there's so much technology as well as capital that's coming to fruition at the same time. So we've got really low interest rates, which mean people can take a lot of risk and they don't have to worry about staying so close to that source of capital. And we've got technology that's allowing people to work remotely and access to the ultimate utility, which is strong internet connection. And Starlink is going to be a huge success because of it. And we're seeing it locally in Toronto. People are giving up their condos. They're moving to the suburbs again. They're buying, second homes or giving up their first homes and moving to the country. But what I think I agree with Chris on is at the end of the day, you're not working 24/7. So there is going to be this other half of your life in everyday form that you're going to want to be a part of a community. And sometimes that community needs to be hundreds of thousands of people for you to get everything you want out of it, whether it's culture, whether it's, great restaurants, great food, all of those things people are not going to want to give up if there's only one restaurant and one Chinese restaurant in town in a small community somewhere. I don't think people are going to want to give all of that up because life isn't only just about working, even though in North America that kind of is how people think. They live to work versus in Europe where they work to live. So I'd be really curious to see how people feel they can stretch themselves. But I agree with Chris. I don't think you're going to see cities like New York, LA, San Francisco change. I just think you're going to see a percentage of people start to pick up and turn other smaller hubs into much bigger hubs like the Austins and the Miamis of the world.
Kind of almost begs an interesting question, which is, how we think about the regionalization of resources, right? There's a real urban planning question, in embedded in this, or regional planning, right? How do you think about, city centers and suburbs? How are resources shared between the two? There start to, some pretty big questions, start to roll out of this. And again, I think this is Just like I always say with startups, we ignore good governance until it's too late. It's probably the same thing with cities and ecosystems and regions.
Yeah, I think we've got a ton of real estate investors. I know we have a lot of real estate investors in our fund. And every time I talk with them, they say it's never been a better time to be a suburban residential home builder and a terrible time to be a downtown condo / large infrastructure builder, because there's just not a commercial builder, because there's just not a lot going on in those areas. But residential has never been busier. And I think the same thing is happening in the US as well. This kind of divulges into the other part I wanted to ask you about, Chris, which is the role of governments and how they often are the last to the party, like you said, with subsidized housing or anything, when helping ecosystems thrive. In Canada, we've been very fortunate until recently to have a pretty supportive grant and venture capital funding ecosystem. But places like California are making it more and more difficult to grow startups with restrictive tax policies, forcing these founders to move to places like Miami and Austin. So what role should governments play in helping build and support startup ecosystems?
We've seen, for 30 years, governments try to build, silicon this, silicon that, silicon. And maybe I'm belying some of my, or exposing some of my, kind of political beliefs here, but I think that, in a lot of these cases, the role of government is to get out of the way. And I think, it's interesting. I was just reading this article in Crunchbase today about somebody who's saying that they are moving their company, and they said, one of the challenges wasn't the taxes, because, by the way, somebody said, that they were moving to Texas because of the better corporate tax, environment. Startups, almost by definition, don't earn money, so don't pay. They don't earn profits, so they don't pay taxes. But it's the individuals, obviously. In California's taxes are pretty steep, but the guy said it's basically these regulations, and he kind of threw out a whole bunch of, things. And the point he made, which actually I thought was interesting, was, it's not any one thing, because individually each of these is reasonable. It's kind of the collection of them together that make for an onerous, kind of thicket. And so I think that's something that people are going to have to consider. Again, how is it that we create and this is what I was talking about with the operating system. How is it that we create a legal and regulatory framework that allows for enterprises to kind of grow unfettered and to create that flywheel effect? And it's not. I don't think it's about subsidies. I don't think it's about creating these parks that some people do that are. Those never seem to work. I think the free market kind of works best.
Yeah, I feel like there's no way to really create like the Delaware for startups. I know there's been a lot of money being put into like Tulsa, Oklahoma, by giving out, $10,000 grants to have people move there and try to get like talent to move there. It doesn't really just work with like one or two things. It has so much more to do with all the things that you've covered today, whether it's like the great ideas, the great talent, the mentorship, the retired successful entrepreneur founders giving back into the community, and all those things that we see all over and over again working in places like California. But then, as we talked about today, has COVID just thrown all that out the window? And what I hear you saying is, I don't think so. It's just going to see a slight shift onto the ones that were on the fence, like that razor's edge of making the change to San Francisco, California, or somewhere else. So I think that makes sense. Before we wrap things up, this has been an incredible chat, Chris. I really appreciate everything. We always like to end every conversation with any book recommendations that the audience should give a read.
A guy that I went to college with wrote a book about a year and a half ago, and this is Jim Ciuto, who's over at CNN, and the book's called The Shadow War, and the subtitle is something along the lines of understanding Russia and China's secret operations to dethrone America, or something like that. And I got to tell you, it's interesting because there are a lot of people who don't think a lot about the geopolitical dynamic today. It's easy to kind of dismiss, kind of geopolitical tensions as, especially in a post-Trump era, as being all kind of politically motivated. But ultimately, there are, and especially as we see, kind of what's going on with Navalny in Russia and elsewhere, there are some different worldviews at play, and people want what we've got. And we read about these hacks, and I think Scioto does a great job of unpacking that box and bringing kind of data to play. And it was a really eye-opening read. For me, I think is stuff worth thinking about going forward.
Yeah, I love book suggestions like that are totally off the beaten path, and I think our audience will as well. So I want to thank you very much, Chris, for joining us in the tank to discuss how to build a lasting startup ecosystem on Clubhouse today. Thanks so much for joining us, Chris.
Awesome. Thank you so much.
Thanks so much for listening to another episode of Tank Talks. To learn more about this episode, be sure to go to Apple Podcast or Spotify to find more detailed notes on this episode and our guest. If you enjoyed this episode, please leave us a review and a rating, as it helps us out a lot. And hit that subscribe button so you can get notified when a new episode comes out. Finally, make sure to give me a follow on Twitter @MattyBCohen or Clubhouse @Ripple_Ventures if you want to be in the audience and ask a question on our next Tank Talk. Till next time,